They didn't just eat the dead. They cracked their skulls open to suck out the brains. This isn't fiction. This isn't myth. This is prehistoric Europe 15,000 years ago, when survival was so brutal, so primal, that the line between man and meat blurred and then disappeared. Buried deep in the silence of time beneath layers of rock and ice, there lies a secret older than civilization itself. It is not a secret carved in ancient script or passed down in legend. It is written in the bones, scarred, shattered, and scraped clean by stone blades. This is the story of Europe's first cold case, a mystery of blood hunger and desperation, a tale told not by words, but by flesh. Long before cities, long before kingdoms, before writing, before gods. Western Europe was a frozen wilderness ruled by the ice. The land was cruel, food was scarce, and humans were not always the hunters. Yet somewhere in the frostbitten darkness, hidden in caves across what is now France, Belgium, and Spain, some tribes turned on their own. Not in war, not in hatred, but in hunger. These were not isolated acts of savagery. This was ritual. This was survival. Today, archaeologists have unearthed chilling evidence from places like Goyet Cave in Belgium and El Sidrón in northern Spain. Bones of men, women, and children found broken, butchered, burned, smashed femurs to access marrow, skull fragments bearing the unmistakable signs of deliberate brain extraction, jaws separated, fingers stripped. Cannibalism. Not as myth, not as horror story, but as fact. The evidence is clinical, cold. But the story it tells is raw. What drives a person to eat another? Was it necessity, ritual revenge, or something darker still, something that lay dormant in the human soul when pushed to the edge? In this documentary, we descend into the icy heart of prehistoric Europe, tracing the footsteps of tribes who vanished without names but left behind bones that still whisper. We will follow the forensic trail led by the scars on ancient skeletons and ask a question that echoes through time. When survival becomes impossible, what remains of our humanity? In the rolling hills of modern-day Belgium, surrounded by trees and farmland, there is a cave. From the outside, it is unremarkable. Just another opening in the limestone cliffs. But step inside, and you're walking into one of the darkest chapters of our species. This is Goyet Cave, a place of ancient rituals, a graveyard of Neanderthals, and perhaps a butcher shop. In the 1990s, archaeologists returned to Goyet after decades of abandonment. What they found stunned even the most seasoned experts. Among thousands of animal bones were human remains, about 99 fragments in total belonging to at least 5 Neanderthal individuals. But these were no ordinary burials. Long bones were cracked open. Skull caps had been carefully removed. The bones bore the same cut marks as reindeer or horse remains from the same site. But these weren't reindeer. These were people, children, adolescents, adults, cannibalized. The evidence was undeniable. The slicing, the crushing, the charring done with precision, and it wasn't just random. It mirrored patterns of known butchery. These weren't violent massacres. These were meals. But why? Was it starvation? Or was it something deeper? A belief system, a rite of passage, a way of honoring the dead by consuming them? We may never know, but the bones are speaking. And what they say is chilling. Almost 1,000 kilometers south of Goyet, another cave tells a similar tale. In 1994, deep in the forests of Asturias, northern Spain, explorers stumbled upon a narrow opening in the rocks. What they found inside would become one of the most significant Neanderthal discoveries in modern history. El Sidrón cave. Over the next 2 decades, excavations revealed the remains of at least 13 Neanderthals, men, women, children, all belonging to the same family group. But once again, the story carved into their bones was not of peace. Many of the remains showed signs of cannibalism, skulls opened with care bones cracked for marrow cuts consistent with skinning and defleshing, teeth marks, burn marks, tool marks. This wasn't the aftermath of a predator attack. It was human, intentional. Even more disturbing DNA analysis showed that the group was highly inbred. Their gene pool had been shrinking. Their world collapsing. Perhaps they were hunted. Perhaps they were dying off. Perhaps they turned on each other in the final desperate days. In the silence of El Sidrón, all that remains are bones and questions. Modern science has no emotion. It sees bones as data, cuts as metrics, fire as carbon traces. But beyond the microscopes and CT scans, there is a human story. These people laughed, loved, cried, held children in their arms, and then they were eaten. To understand cannibalism in the Ice Age, we must first understand the world these people lived in. It was not a world of comfort. It was a world locked in frost. Roughly 40,000 years ago, the Earth plunged into one of the coldest phases in its history. Gigantic glaciers sprawled across northern Europe. Snow blanketed the land for months. The sun was pale and brief, and survival was a relentless war against cold, hunger, and death. The people who roamed these lands were not Homo sapiens, not yet. They were Neanderthals, our evolutionary cousins, as intelligent as us in many ways, perhaps even more robust. They walked upright, spoke in complex ways, buried their dead-made tools, and likely had art and ritual. But they were outnumbered, outcompeted, and eventually overwhelmed. By 40,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had arrived in Europe. Modern humans migrating from Africa carrying new technologies, new social systems, and a ravenous will to survive. The Neanderthals were slowly pushed to the fringes, isolated, starving, dying. It is in these conditions, harsh winters, empty stomachs, dwindling hope, that cannibalism emerges not as madness, but as logic. In a frozen landscape where animals vanished, where even trees struggled to grow, a dead body was not just a tragedy. It was calories. It was life. And the question was never moral. It was mathematical. Bones from Goyet and El Sidrón reveal this brutal calculus. Neanderthals didn't merely scavenge their dead, they processed them. Strategically, repeatedly. In some cases, they seemed to favor children and adolescents, perhaps because their meat was easier to cut, or perhaps because the elders had already died. This was not random. This was systemic. In modern anthropology, such acts are classified as nutritional cannibalism, a behavior driven by starvation. But others argue there may have been ritualistic motives as well, because the way the bones were handled often mirrored burial practices. Could it be that eating the dead was a form of communion? A spiritual rite, a way of keeping loved ones within the tribe even after death? Or were the Neanderthals simply trying to survive one more day? We do not know. But in the cold clarity of Ice Age Europe, the choice may have been this: eat or die. Of all the discoveries at El Sidrón, one group of bones tells a story almost too painful to bear. A nuclear family, a father, a mother, their children. Their DNA confirms it. This was not a war party. This was not conquest. It was intimacy turned grotesque. The adults bore defensive wounds. The children's bones were cracked apart. All were cannibalized, not by strangers, by each other. Some speculate that they were the last of their clan slowly starving inside the cave, cut off by weather, or by enemies, or by fate. And in those final days when every shadow stretched too long and every echo reminded them of death, the taboo shattered. One child dies, the others live for a while. Another dies, then another, until there is nothing left but silence and bones. Researchers have tried to piece together the order of events from the pattern of cuts and burns. They suggest a slow unraveling, a sequence of deaths over days or weeks. Perhaps a brutal accident was the spark. Perhaps disease took the first life. But once the line was crossed, it was never uncrossed. This was not murder. It was desperation. And yet what lingers in the story of El Sidrón is not just horror. It is sorrow. It is the echo of a family that loved and suffered and tried in the face of extinction to endure. Across the fields of anthropology, archaeology, and paleontology, the question of Ice Age cannibalism sparks debate. Some experts argue it was strictly pragmatic, a matter of calories in versus calories out. Others point to patterns too deliberate to be accidental. The placement of bones, the repetition of specific cuts, the charring without full cremation. There is also evidence from later human cultures far after the Ice Age where cannibalism was symbolic. Among the Wari in the Amazon, the Fore in Papua New Guinea, even certain Celtic and Scythian tribes of ancient Europe, cannibalism was used to honor the dead, to preserve their spirit, to prevent the body from rotting alone in the dirt. Could the Neanderthals have done the same? Did they believe the soul linger in the flesh, or did they simply run out of options? It is impossible to know for certain. They left no words, no art in these caves, only broken bones and shadows. But what we do know is this: they were human, not monsters, not beasts, and in the bitter end, they behaved exactly as desperate humans have throughout history. They ate what was available, even if it was each other. Bones do not lie. They do not forget. And under the scrutiny of modern science, they speak. Every mark etched into a Neanderthal femur, every fracture spiraling through a skull, tells a story that even time cannot erase. The work of forensic archaeologists is not unlike that of detectives in a cold case unit, sifting through ancient remains for evidence of tools, techniques, and intentions. At Goyet Cave, those stories are carved with harrowing clarity. Microscopic analysis revealed something chilling. The same cut marks made on animal bones used for food were present on human bones. The incision points on tibius and ribs were deliberate, sharp, practiced, and efficient. There were even signs of percussion, flaking, when a bone is struck with a stone tool to break it open for marrow. It wasn't a matter of chance. It was craftsmanship, cold, calculated, repetitive. At El Sidrón, the forensic picture grows darker. Skulls had been opened with precise blows to extract brains and organ rich in fat and essential nutrients. Joints were disarticulated with care. Muscle tissue was stripped clean. In some cases, the bones bore burn marks, suggesting they had been roasted or placed near fire. Even the tongue bones, rarely found intact, were missing, likely removed for consumption. But perhaps the most disturbing find was the modification of finger bones. They were crushed, not just for marrow, but possibly for every ounce of edible tissue. Not even the smallest parts were spared. Some scientists propose that the sheer thoroughness of the butchery implies more than starvation. It hints at routine, repetition, cultural knowledge, cannibalism, not as exception but tradition. And while modern minds recoil at the thought these Ice Age people, Neanderthals, did not carry our concepts of morality, they did what was necessary or what was taught. In their eyes, this may not have been desecration. It may have been survival or reverence, or both. To fully grasp the meaning of prehistoric cannibalism, we must step beyond the caves of Europe and look across time, because cannibalism, as taboo as it may be today, is not unique to Neanderthals. In Melanesia, in the Amazon, among the Anasazi in North America, human history is littered with moments when flesh became food, sometimes in ritual, sometimes in famine, sometimes as vengeance. Among the Aztecs, captives were sacrificed and eaten as part of a sacred rite. Among the Maori, consuming an enemy was the final domination. Even in modern times, there are documented cases from the Donner Party in 1846 trapped in the snows of the Sierra Nevada, to the crash of Flight 571 in the Andes in 1972. When humans are pushed far enough beyond law, beyond culture, beyond hope, they return to something ancient. And in that ancient darkness, Neanderthals were already waiting. By 39,000 years ago, the Neanderthals were vanishing. One by one, their strongholds fell silent. Caves once warmed by fire grew cold. Tools lay untouched. Children were never born. Their numbers had been dwindling for centuries due to climate shifts, low genetic diversity, disease, and the relentless spread of Homo sapiens. By the time we arrive at Goyet and El Sidrón, we are witnessing not just acts of cannibalism, but echoes of extinction. These bones are the last cries of a people at the end of their world. Imagine them huddled in darkness, the wind howling outside, snow sealing the entrance to the cave. A child coughs. A mother weeps. A brother goes silent and never wakes up. They bury him, then dig him back up and eat, not because they wanted to, because they had no other choice. The Ice Age was not just a struggle against nature. It was a reckoning with the self, and Neanderthals, our forgotten kin, faced it alone. Not all bones in Goyet Cave belong to Neanderthals. Buried deeper in different strata, archaeologists unearthed something even more provocative: the remains of anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, dated to roughly 27,000 years ago. And among them, familiar signs. Cut marks, fractured skulls, bones split from marrow, jawbones smashed open. For decades, the popular narrative held Neanderthals as the other primitive savage different from us. But the bones in Goyet challenged that notion, because these were not Neanderthals. These were us, our species, our ancestors, our hands on the knife. The same behaviors once attributed to desperation in Neanderthals now appeared in Homo sapiens. So what does that say? That cannibalism was not a genetic flaw in Neanderthals, it was a shared inheritance. It was a choice made by humans under pressure again and again, when food ran out, when the winters were long, when the moral compass cracked under the weight of survival. This changes everything. Goyet is no longer just a site of Neanderthal suffering, it's a mirror, a dark one. We were no better. One of the most haunting finds in Goyet was the skull of a child no more than 6 years old. The cranium had been cleanly removed from the base of the skull. The edges were smooth polished by the repeated handling of human hands. Analysis showed deliberate percussion marks. The top of the skull had been turned into a bowl. This is not unheard of. Across various prehistoric cultures, skull cups have been discovered used possibly for rituals, possibly as trophies, perhaps even for drinking. But this was a child. What were the people of Goyet doing? Was this a funerary tradition, a rite of remembrance, a sign of honor, or dominance? Or was it something darker still? Researchers cannot say with certainty, but the implications are deeply unsettling. Here again, we find cannibalism blending into ritual, a thin line between death and reverence, between consumption and ceremony. These people, whoever they were, had not simply butchered a body. They had transformed it. They had used it. They had remembered it. Why does cannibalism disturb us so deeply? It is arguably the most ancient taboo in the human psyche. Found in nearly every culture, religion, and moral code, the act of consuming another human being is seen as the ultimate transgression, a rupture in the social fabric, a descent into madness. But this fear is not purely cultural. It is psychological. To eat another is to violate the boundary between self and other, between human and animal, between memory and flesh. And yet when the context changes, so too does the meaning. When famine strikes, when isolation breeds desperation, when death outpaces life, the mind rewrites itself. There are modern accounts from war zones, from disasters, from psychiatric wards of people breaking the taboo under extreme conditions. And when they speak of it afterward, the stories are eerily similar. I had no choice. I stopped seeing them as a person, I just wanted to live. The Neanderthals of El Sidrón may have felt the same. They were not monsters. They were human, which is what makes it worse. For over a century, Neanderthals were depicted as brutes, dim-witted, violent, doomed. Cannibalism was used as proof. See, the textbook said, they ate each other. No wonder they died out. But the evidence now tells a different story. They cared for their sick. They buried their dead. They made tools, pigments, ornaments. They lived in family units. They may have had language, music, and memory. And they died not because they were inferior, but because the world changed too fast. Climate collapsed. Populations fragmented. Contact with Homo sapiens brought competition and disease. It wasn't a single blow, but a slow erosion until only bones were left behind. Bones that bear the marks of everything they endured and everything they became. Goyet and El Sidrón are not crime scenes. They are memorials, not to savagery, but to survival. To what humans will do when pushed to the edge, to what we carry within us still. To imagine the world of Goyet and El Sidrón, we must go deeper beyond the bones, into the caves themselves, into the minds of the people who once called them home. Picture this, the flicker of firelight casting long shadows on limestone walls, the stench of smoke and wet earth, the faint sounds of flint striking flint, children huddled under furs, their breath visible in the frigid air. A woman grinds ochre into powder. A man sharpens a blade from a river-worn stone. These caves were not mere shelters. They were sanctuaries, wombs of warmth in a frozen world, spaces of ritual memory and fear. In El Sidrón, the interior stretches deep, nearly 600 meters of twisting passageways and chambers. The main occupation site sits far from natural light, accessible only by crawling through a tight, dangerous tunnel. Why go so far? Some suggest protection from predators, from rival groups, from the wind that cut like knives. But others suggest something else: seclusion, ritual, death. Because in the deepest parts of these caves, where no daylight ever reached the bones, were found. Neanderthals did not scatter their dead. They chose where to leave them. And in choosing the dark, they may have believed the spirits lingered there, or that the cave itself had power. At Goyet, the situation is different. The entrance is wide, light-filled. The bone deposits were found near hearths and food waste. The human remains were mixed with animal bones, suggesting domestic life, even community. But here too, the signs point to cannibalism not as chaos, but as culture. Cut marks suggest dismemberment with intention. Burn marks imply roasting. The pattern of bone dispersion hints at shared meals. These were not murders. These were meals. But more than that, they were moments. Moments in the cold where families, starving and terrified, gathered around the fire and did the unthinkable: to live. Among the most heartbreaking discoveries in both caves are the remains of children. At El Sidrón, a child between the ages of 2 and 3. At Goyet, several adolescents and 1 infant. Their bones were not spared. This raises a terrible question: were they killed, or were they simply the first to die of exposure, illness, or hunger? Child mortality in the Paleolithic era was staggering. Nearly half of all children died before the age of 10. A minor wound, a bad winter, or a missed hunt could spell the end. So when a child died and there was no food, we recoil from the thought. But in their world, this may have been an act of collective survival. A decision no one wanted to make, yet one everyone had to live with. The children's bones, too, were marked, cut, cracked, burned, but they were not forgotten. Some show signs of deliberate arrangement: bones placed near hearths or buried under ochre, symbols of memory, of sorrow, or of hope. We do not know, but in those fragments we find not just evidence of cannibalism. We find love, the kind of love that breaks when nothing can be done, the kind that still wraps a child in furs, even if there's no food left. Somewhere in these same valleys, Belgium, Spain, southern France, another drama was unfolding. Modern humans had arrived. They came from the east and south, moving up from the Levant into the forests of Europe. They were leaner, with longer limbs. They brought spear throwers, barbed harpoons, needles made of bone. And they brought art. Cave walls in nearby regions exploded with color bison, mammoth horses' handprints. Symbols whose meanings are lost, but whose presence cannot be denied. Homo sapiens were dreaming, imagining, remembering. Did they meet the Neanderthals? Yes, and sometimes they did more than meet. At El Sidrón, mitochondrial DNA shows no interbreeding. But at other sites, Vindija in Croatia, Denisova in Siberia, traces of Neanderthal blood remain in us today. Up to 2% of your genome, if you're of European or Asian descent, is Neanderthal. You carry them in your bones, in your immune system, in your sleep cycles, in your fear, and perhaps in your hunger. If the Ice Age returned tomorrow, if the lights went out, the food stopped coming, the sky turned white with snow, how long before we forgot the rules? How long before we remembered the taste of marrow? History says not long. From the siege of Leningrad, to the shipwreck of the Medusa, to prison camps and plane crashes and failed expeditions, human beings have proven one terrifying truth again and again. We are not above this. We never were. We are the descendants of survivors, of those who could do what had to be done, of those who broke taboos to bury their children inside themselves, of those who sat around fires, passed the bones, and looked away. The caves of Goyet and El Sidrón are not distant. They are waiting, inside us. In science, there is evidence, and then there is absence. What is missing speaks as loudly as what remains. In Goyet and El Sidrón, we have bones marked, burned, broken. But we do not have their voices. We do not have their names. No language, no writing, no prayers etched in stone. Just fragments. A humerus sawn through, a jaw split in two, a femur cracked for its marrow. And yet between these cold remains lies the ache of humanity. We ask questions not because the bones whisper, but because they don't. Did they scream? Did they beg? Did they grieve? The cave walls are silent. No paintings remain in Goyet. No songs are echoed in El Sidrón. These were not the ornate galleries of Lascaux or Chauvet. These were working spaces, dying spaces. Still, some scientists wonder, were there rituals we cannot detect? Soundless gestures passed from hand to hand. Could the arrangement of bones, the scorched stones, the repeated patterns have been a kind of prehistoric liturgy, an unwritten funeral? If so, then perhaps cannibalism was not only an act of necessity, but also an act of memory, to eat a body so that the soul would remain within the group, to share the flesh so that no one would die alone. We will never know what these people believed, but we know they felt, because we feel it too. Today, archaeologists wear gloves. They work with brushes and trowels. They log every bone photograph, every marked date, every layer. But at the heart of their work is something deeply uncomfortable. We are exhuming the bodies of our ancestors. We are dissecting them, scanning them, speaking for them. Is this science or desecration? When researchers at El Sidrón drilled into teeth and skulls for isotopic analysis, they did so with purpose. They wanted to know what these people ate, what climate they lived in, what pathogens they carried. But at what cost? The bones are brittle, the stories incomplete, and the people long gone cannot consent. Some indigenous communities today argue that the dead should be left buried, that disturbing human remains, even for knowledge, violates sacred ground. But others argue that forgetting is worse, that silence is its own kind of violence, that by uncovering these lives, we give them a kind of second breath. And perhaps that is true, because today the world knows their story, and they are no longer just bones. Behind every discovery are human hands, modern ones. It was Dr. Ana Garcia in Asturias who first crawled into El Sidrón's winding interior, nearly suffocating in the narrow tunnels to reach the chamber where 13 Neanderthals waited. It was Dr. Paul Toussaint in Belgium who returned to Goyet decades after it was forgotten, re-examining mislabeled boxes in a museum basement, only to discover they weren't just animal bones. They were people. These archaeologists didn't just find skeletons, they found the story no one had told. They worked for years, underfunded, unrecognized, dust in their lungs, doubt in their minds. But they knew something important had happened here. And they were right, because without them, we would never have known that in the darkest corners of Ice Age Europe, humans survived not through kindness or cruelty, but something older, necessity. The truth buried for 30,000 years had waited. And now it was free. Close your eyes. You are in a cave. It is winter. The fire has died. Your child hasn't eaten in days. The old man has stopped breathing. There is no game in the woods, no roots under the snow. You sit in silence. The others look at you, at him, at the knife. There is no debate, just silence. And the crack of bone. Goyet, El Sidrón. Other caves not yet found. They are not stories of monsters. They are stories of us. Not the best of us, not the worst, just the real. We are not here because of gods or fate or glory. We are here because someone long ago in the cold chose to eat. And though we would like to believe we have evolved beyond such horrors, the truth lingers beneath our civility. We are the descendants of the desperate. And the bones still whisper, not of shame, but of survival.